Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Ann and Aspen, for hosting. Thank you, Secretary McQueen, for completely throwing me off with the pork rinds and Coke and gumbo and then Broadway show tunes. I'm a little scattered to the start. So again, my name is Joe Annotti. I'm a Senior Vice President at GNA. While we are based in Santa Monica, I'm local, well, local-ish. I'm based out of New Orleans. We've been working in the clean transportation space now for 30 years, and one of our focus points is really the connection points between technology and deployment. How do we get the things that make our world better out and proliferate and move out into the world? And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is our State of Sustainable Fleets report. This is a public and free report. We are publishing it, the next iteration of it, in about 10 days. This will be published on May 1st. That will be our 2022 report. It's at stateofsustainablefleets.com, so you can go there. The goal of the report is to provide an overview of our world, of the clean transportation landscape. And it's not just a simple trend of saying there's more EVs and we're done, but it's across all alternative fuel types, across all opportunities and all market segments, looking at the areas for different technologies for deployments and opportunities therein. So I want to take a look a little bit about what we're seeing, and really the focus points this year are money, time, and trends. And so when we look first at money, Secretary McQueen mentioned a couple opportunities, the Inflation Reduction Act and Volkswagen, and going back to the start of my governmental career was with the EPA under the Obama administration with the Recovery Act funding. I ran a team there that was responsible for about $300 million of that Recovery Act funding, and then on into the DERA program days from 2008 through 2013. And so when we look at money now, we can go back and 6 years ago is a relatively short timeline, but 6 years ago was the Volkswagen Trust. The first whispers of that lawsuit were starting to come around right around in the springtime of 2016. And the number then was $2.925 billion. That was the big exciting number. Now, if you went 7 years before that, it was $300 million. That was the Recovery Act, right? Okay, so 6 years ago, $3 billion. Now we're talking. Just last year, we now have this pretty substantial landscape shift where we're seeing funding, but the kind of per truck volumes are dropping. If you think about the VW money in California initially, it was $200,000 per Class 8 truck. That was the incentive. Big dollars. That sort of stagnated and maybe a little bit just dropped. But then the EVSE incentives started to charge. Utilities started getting into the games. PG&E, SCE, and San Diego Gas and Electric cumulatively have $900 million just in vehicle electrification incentives in California. Dominion, Entergy, Southern are all in the game now too with their own incentive programs. But now, so remember that $2.925 billion, that's like peanuts now. It's crazy. You look at these numbers from the bipartisan infrastructure law, $243 billion. IRA is $115 billion. CARB, the state agency, just their environmental budget for transportation is $23 billion annually. These are huge pots of money, and they're all available. And so the question nowadays becomes less of if there's money, but where and what strings are attached with it. These funding programs can be incredibly burdensome. And I would take I know a lot of the folks in this room. There's not a lot of you whose day jobs is compliance for incentives. That's horrible. That's not something you want to actively go out and seek and be like, that sounds like a really fun career. That's not in your job descriptions. But if you're going to chase this money and pursue these funding programs and be a part of this stuff, that level of intelligence is going to have to be built within-house or with third-party expertise. It just has to be. These are contractual obligations. These aren't gifts. It's not a charitable donation from a government agency to your efforts. These are contractual obligations with pretty substantial strings attached. So one of the other things that we're seeing with money as of late, so in this market, there's always the discussion about chicken and egg. And I don't know, frankly, which one's the chicken and the egg of the vehicles or the infrastructure. You can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me. But in this particular case, we're seeing a shift. And that shift historically was focus on the vehicle funding first. If you put stuff on the road, the stuff required to fuel those things on the road will follow. And so we saw that. We saw that with the DERA program, about a little less than $100 million annually. We saw that with California's HFIP program, which is about $500 or $600 million annually. And similar programs that will be created with the Inflation Reduction Act money, it's called Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles. Those programs are now, still continuing to proliferate, but they're being overshadowed. And they're being overshadowed by the incentive money focused on infrastructure. So things like the Volkswagen settlement still has $293 million left in the kitty for that program. Utility incentives are well over $1 billion annually now. The charging and fueling infrastructure program is another $2.5 billion that was just kicked into the market. I'll get into more on this one in a second. And then the other big one nowadays is NEVI. We saw the map from Secretary McQueen with Oklahoma. That's not just an Oklahoma thing, it's everywhere. And so that's another $5 billion program. And so you're starting to see a lot more weight in terms of volume of incentives shift into the infrastructure space, and to address really the critical path right now in at least electrification is the time and availability of technology and equipment to get on site and power this stuff. And so we're seeing that shift take place. These are two programs. The focus is ZEV, although alternative fuels are eligible, particularly for the charging and fueling infrastructure program. So I'm mentioning ZEV because that is primarily where the tailwinds are here. But I want to make a reference point, just, this is not just a zero emission shill piece kind of thing. So the first program, the NEVI program, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, $5 billion. We're seeing programs open right now. If any of you guys are going home to Alaska, then your RFP is open. So I don't know that that's frankly an option, but go for it. It's based on the allocation of eligible corridors within your state. So if you have been working with Ann and Aspen on the corridor plan here, you know that there are certain corridors within Louisiana. Those are eligible. Because they're eligible, you get a certain cut of that $5 billion. Texas is in the lead with $403 million, and then it trickles down from there. Those plans are going to provide the guidance tools on how the money is going to be allocated over the next 5 years. Really, really valuable information. The other program that was just announced is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program. This is a federally run program through the Federal Highway Administration. There's $2.5 billion in the total bucket, but the first tranche of funding that's open now is $700 million. 350 of that will go towards corridors, and 350 will go towards communities. So anything off of a highway. It is heavily, heavily subscribed right now. There is a fever pitch in some of these key, California in particular, Florida, New York. There's a lot of activity to pursue this funding. So I encourage you to research some more if that's of interest to you. When we talk about incentives and we talk about money, it's not a clean way to pursue just the vehicle funding anymore. Typically the path has been, okay, well, I got to buy this, $200,000 natural gas truck. If I can get it written down a little bit, then I'm okay, because the fueling infrastructure will come, your refueling provider will help me with the deal and the cost, and it'll level. The costs have increased to such a point, and the supply has been limited to such a point that the pathway to incentives involves stacking much more readily than we've seen in the past. And so what I mean by that is you got to first look at funding for the infrastructure, then the charger or the plug, and the vehicle, and then the fuel itself. And so when you start stacking incentives, these are all four of these funding streams. You have to find incentives from a different place. So maybe the infrastructure incentives comes from the utility. The charger incentive comes from a local business development or NPO or something like that. The vehicle incentive could come from the feds or from a state funding allocation, whereas the fuel credits maybe comes from the RINs program, or if you're out west, the LCFS or CFS programs. Only then, if you can put all those pieces together and start making those allocations and economics work, and the timing of securing those things work, that's really the way that we've seen the total cost effectiveness actually be successful and viable within 3-4 years. These are if you look at the Class 8 market, these are $400,000, $500,000 pieces of equipment, plus all the infrastructure associated to go with it. These are extremely expensive opportunities, but opportunities nevertheless. The last thing I want to talk about with money before I get into time and trends is the expectations of what you can get as an incentive versus the reality of what actually comes in. So if you look at these are kind of marquee programs that we look at. I did a really good job with the Texas E-Rig program. Sorry if you're from Texas, I completely forgot to fill that in. It's not zero. That's not a knock on Texas or anything. But the expectations, so like let's take the EPA program. In their RFP, you could go after and apply for 40% of your new vehicle costs. Not bad. I can go shake down $180,000, $200,000 maybe per vehicle. In reality, it's more like $75,000 to $125,000. It is a fiction to think that you would be able to go for that amount, because that amount is aspirational. The way that the funding programs score those types of things are based on NOx cost effectiveness or project cost effectiveness or eligible geographies. There's a lot more factors than saying, okay, you just get your 45%. And you can learn that if you go and look at their historical funding levels. They publish their awards, you can do the math, you can just kind of see those things play out. But there are other programs where expectation does match reality. Those voucher style programs, the rebates and credits, those are much more in line with let's set a precedent and follow through with it. Okay, time. Actually, let's do a quick time check while we're on the topic. So when we look at these incentive programs, waiting until a solicitation open is a real great way to do poorly. And so when you're looking at these opportunities, there's a process that we follow. And so just for frame of reference here, I have 20 people who work for me who just day in, day out, go talk to funding agencies. So at any given moment in our market, there's about 600 different incentive programs in the clean transportation space. We're engaging them, finding what they're up to, what their new priorities are going to be, what's on the horizon. And so for all of these programs, we go through a process before it even opens to understand first what's eligible, second what's viable, and then three what's competitive. And so only by going through that process do we actually come to a point where we were recommending to actually pursue the money. If you're not eligible from the get-go, like, okay, you're written off. We're not going to chase. But if you're eligible and maybe it's not viable, like, maybe you have to put a truck on the road in 18 months, but your OEM is saying it's going to take 24 to deliver, not viable. But maybe you're eligible and viable, you'll get that truck in time, but your new piece of equipment is only expected to run 10,000 miles a year, whereas we know from previous solicitations they want to see 20 to 30,000 miles a year out of new equipment. Well, you're not going to be competitive. So yeah, you can check all the boxes, but your dollar per ton cost effectiveness is not going to be something that really gets the funding agency going. And so we take a lot of time up front to understand with these incentive programs what that pathway looks like. So here's the slide. Again, it's so good, I'll show you twice. One of the other things about time is as of late, we've seen funding timelines shift. And so in a traditional incentive model, this is kind of how it typically plays out. So you apply, get the award a couple months later, the vehicle or piece of equipment or infrastructure gets deployed, 6 months after that, let's say, and then you move into the reporting phase. And that reporting phase is basically your justification of why the agency is giving you money. I'm reduced this amount of tons, I ran this amount of mileage, I consumed this amount of clean fuel. And you report through the life of the project, 3 years, 5 years typically. We've seen that shift as of late, and this is particularly relevant to ZEV incentives in particular, but as some of the supply chain issues are affecting other industries, we're seeing it there too. But you can see that the grant application and award follow suit. But now we're seeing a much broader timeline required to address infrastructure and the actual technology to be deployed. So agencies are saying, okay, well, instead of giving you a 12-month requirement to put this on the road, we're seeing a lot of agencies say, okay, you can have 24 to 36 months after award to make this project happen. And that's what we've seen these projects, slow down is maybe not the right description, but we've seen these big breadth of timeline windows start to open up when you have to address supply chain issues. It will note, though, my kind of offhanded comment about nobody in here does incentives compliance. You'll still be required to report on that money, even though you're waiting for the technology, because you're still under contract. You are still a steward of state money. You're still going to be under the gun for those reporting requirements. So while you may not have that piece of technology yet, you'll still be required to talk about it and submit reports. 3 big challenges right now with the incentive market. One are the operational requirements. Am I going to run this thing a sufficient amount of miles or hours per year? Is it in the right location? Does the range meet what I need? The traditional OEMs in the market right now, their EVs are 125 to 250 miles per tank. That doesn't meet everybody's needs. So does that meet yours? When we look at the implementation timeline, is the product that does meet your need available when you need it? Does the construction timeline or the construction implications impinge on your footprint? Don't break concrete twice, kind of thing. And then what are the types of operational disruptions to your yard? Do you have to give up? Do you have to give up hoteling space? What does that look like? And then the last one is stakeholder management. With a lot of this funding, especially the new money that's coming out, these Justice 40 initiatives, the disadvantaged communities, these types of requirements, a very clean incentive program is a simple relationship between a fleet, the one looking to acquire the technology, the funding agency looking to fund the acquiring of that technology, and the producer of that technology. That's a simple transaction. This new money that's coming out requires involvements of stakeholder groups and environmental nonprofits and labor agreements and other funding agencies and the utilities, and we're seeing projects now go from 3 stakeholders to 15 stakeholders. And so the kind of too many cooks in the kitchen issue is becoming more and more prevalent because the amount of communication required for the same style of projects has dramatically increased. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is trends. So this is our 4th year doing the State of Sustainable Fleets report. Again, this is public. It will be published May 1st at ACT Expo in Anaheim this year. I hope you guys can join us. We'll have about 12 to 13,000 folks in attendance, a few hundred zero and near zero emission vehicles. There's a riding drone, which seems awesome to me, but they're marketing it for the California wineries. So rather than driving a diesel truck around, you get in your drone and fly and check on your property. Totally available to the mass market, very good price point, obviously. But the State of Sustainable Fuel report is a guidance book. It's tools and guidance for our industry. So we pull in experts from across the landscape, across all the various fuel types. We publish mini guides on each basket of fuel. So there's hydrogen, electric, natural gas, and propane. Each has their own mini guide, and then with kind of overall trends and reports. I'll talk briefly about what was in the last one, just to give you a sense of kind of what the hierarchy of our reports look like. But I encourage you to check out the new one on May 1st, which is a Monday and a half from now, for kind of updated trends analysis. So the latest findings that we have are continued growth in the renewable space. So that's RD and RNG. Those have been particularly buoyed by clean fuel programs. For example, in California, the natural gas consumed as a transportation fuel has now been completely displaced and is almost entirely renewable natural gas. Now, for the renewable natural gas guys, that's great. Yes, good for us. But that has depressed dramatically the LCFS credit price for electric charging. So whereas the credit price was $200 per ton of carbon dioxide reduced in California, if you plugged in your vehicle, it's now about $60. And that's because of the, some would say glut, others would say volume of RNG that's being consumed in the transportation states in California. CNG and propane, those particular markets have seen enough deployment and enough market penetration where they can commercialize and continue to commercialize without incentives. However, many still do benefit from it. Battery electric vehicles are ramping up. It's much more beyond the light duty space. I'm going to be at an event on Friday with Cisco in Riverside, California, where they are deploying their first tranche of 90 battery electric Class 8 tractors for food service delivery. Really, really exciting project. A whole lot of megawatts going to be consumed at that one, but really exciting. We're seeing more about hydrogen fuel cells. So if you look at the recent DOE Super Truck Awards, I think 3 or 4 of the 5 awards were for a heavy-duty Class 8 hydrogen fuel cell truck. Some pretty cool stuff there. And the last one, it's not just California anymore. California has always been the bastion for this stuff. They've got the CARB waiver. They can do whatever their thing. They're their own little island, all that kind of stuff. It's not that way anymore. California led the way with LCFS. We now see it Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Quebec. California led the way with the Advanced Clean Fleet, Advanced Clean Truck regulations. There's now 13 states that those regulations are on the docket. They are now not the only one doing greenhouse gas markets. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and somebody else up there have RGGI funding. So this stuff is moving out past California. And so there's a lot of movement in that space. So just because it's happening there is not an appropriate conclusion anymore that it's not going to happen here. I do have some, as the report goes into deeper dives on individual segments like the battery electric vehicle segment, I wanted to share this graphic, and I'll wrap up here. As part of our State of Sustainable Fleets, we go out and survey fleets and drivers and people in the field. And I thought you guys would appreciate, this is kind of some of the feedback on what feels better with a ZEV and what doesn't. So equal or better performance of your diesel vehicle, emissions, obviously, but the noise and odor, to echo Secretary McQueen's comments about the PM coming out of the back of that thing. And then you look at adoption challenges. So far and away, the vehicle cost and the range are the biggest issues thus far. Not exactly groundbreaking information, but it's in line with what we're hearing. We have some deeper dives, and this is all publicly information, so you guys can take it and run with it. Information on CNG, RD, RNG, and that's it. So like I said, this will be announced Monday, May 1st. We'll be doing it in person at our event in Anaheim, but it will be publicly available online, as I mentioned, at stateofsustainablefleets.com. So thank you again for the time. Thank you to the sponsors again for having me, and entertain any questions you may have, or otherwise we'll continue on. So thank you very much.